God, after an invitation like that, I really got problems. Anyway, let's see if the technology works. A slight problem. This controls that, but every time I
too low.
that's not right. Ah, got it. Right. Sorry about that. So the title is flawed and futile. Climate change, the electricity market, and the emissions trading scheme. And I think it's a fairly accurate summary, actually. So, is climate change fraud? The answer really is yes.
It's not.
The answer is yes. Predictions of dangerous global warming rely on computer models. All rely on computer models. There's two ways of predicting future climate. One is by observing what's happening and trying to work out what natural cycles are doing, and the other one is climate models, which are nonsense. So all the IPCC stuff is climate models, not analysing what the climate has done, what it might do, and why. So anyone who says they can confidently predict global climate changes is either a fool or a fraud. And I believe that's absolutely true. And this is proof. Here the other CSIRO who's brought into global warming in a big deal. This report is based on computer modelling. Models involve simplifications of real processes that are not fully understood. No responsibility is accepted by the Queensland government for the accuracy of forecasts or predictions inferred from this report. You can say that of every report from the IPCC, every report put out by a district council on sea level rise, and we've got to do this, and we've got to do that. All of them come back to this. And it's nonsense, but out of their own mouths. So this is one example of why I believe it's fraud. I only put this curve together a little while ago, like yesterday. So, here, it's working. Technology is letting me down badly. Up, down. Right. Here you've got the record of actual temperatures over the last 10 years or so. They're just flat. So there's a record of actual temperatures, pretty flat. And here's the battery flat. Here's a record of the predictions from one of the typical climate models. And as you can see, this goes up. But the interesting thing is, here we are here now in 2011, and here's the temperature right now. And if, as they say, the models will be accurate over a 20-year time horizon, which originally 10 years. I remember David Rapp taking me apart in the newspaper because I expected climate models to be accurate in a 5-year time cycle. He said, no, they're accurate in the 10. The 10 years is up, and David Rapp didn't respond when I asked him about that. Anyway, if they are to be accurate in a 10-year time cycle, this is what the temperatures have got to do over the next 9 years. And that means a temperature rise of by 0.7 degrees in 6 years, which is a warming of 12 degrees per century. This is ridiculous. It can't happen. And it would be only coming out of the ice age have the temperatures ever risen that fast. Recently the temperature's been pretty stable. So that's one example of the fraud. But then here we are, here's the correlation between carbon dioxide and temperature. Carbon dioxide going up. Hey, in the 1970s the temperature went up too. I wonder why. Oh, that's due to the sun. Oh yeah. So why isn't this due to the sun? Because our climate models say it's not. Oh, get real. It is, in fact, almost certainly due to the sun. Then, look at this. Temperature again, and here we have the Pacific decadal oscillation and the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. Add the two together, and you get an extremely good match. Now, correlation doesn't prove cause and effect. It certainly didn't before, when correlation was pathetic. But here the correlation is pretty good. So it does raise questions. Is there a connection between the two? And of course, there probably is. But we still do not understand how the climate works. And all the best scientists are saying we still cannot predict the climate. We can identify natural cycles, and that's about it. Anyway, why this big panic about global warming? What's so bad about global warming? What's so bad about increase in CO2? Everything's growing better. Grass and everything, and all the plants are growing about 15% better as a result of this recent increase in carbon dioxide. Greenhouses run at 900 parts per million. The present level is 380. They get 40% better production. So here we are. Here's the temperature history of the world from the greenhouse ice cores, the Minoan warm period, the Roman warm period, medieval warm period, and the late 20th century warm period. And what do we know about all those periods? The time when civilizations and people prospered. Populations exploded. In the medieval warm period, they had so much surplus wealth, they were around building cathedrals like mad. They were all built during the time when it was warm. And it was warmer than now. So why are we worried about global warming? But when you look at the cold periods, just after the medieval warm period, it went cold. That was the time of the Little Ice Age, plagues, famine, disease, and war. So there's no doubt cold weather is bad and warm weather is good. And why anybody says anything else, I cannot understand. That's it. World record high temperatures. Now, if the world's getting warmer, you would expect the high temperatures to go up. World record high temperatures. Only one record since 1950, and it's in Scott Baker. And I bet you they didn't have any records before 1950. Only one. And most of them, quite a lot of them, in the 1800s. Or the early 1900s, 1912, 1905. Come on. Where's all this global warming? And then the sea level is rising, the sea level is going to rise, and we've all got to shift our beach houses and things like this. Vast numbers of people have had the valuation of their seaside land drop because regional councils are believing this crap. But here's the actual record of the sea level at Tobago, which is descending under the sea. We all know that, and they're going to sue all the nations for spewing out carbon dioxide. And here's the record from their own tide gauges. Does that show any still rising sea level? The bottom record is from the Australian government tide gauges, which are extremely accurate, and they were set up because they were sure that they would show conclusively that sea level was rising. And they didn't. So they seem to have abandoned it. And then this is another thing with the curve of mine, which is the linking the southern oscillation to world temperatures. The Southern Oscillation Index is a measure of the El Niño effect. It goes up and down, and some friends of mine did some research and established there's a 7-month lag between the temperatures, the change in the La Niña cycle, and the change in temperatures. So I immediately used this to predict future temperatures, which I did quite successfully a year ago. And I started off here because I saw this big drop in the SOI, and I said in 7 months' time, world temperature is going to drop. And sure enough, at the end of 2010, the big crash in temperatures. Now, since then, it's continued to drop quite nicely. Now it's gone back up again, and this got me worried. So I checked this morning, and world temperatures have gone down again. So this is an exaggerated response to that kick. But towards the end of this year, temperatures will go up again. I make that as a prediction. And it's a bloody sight better than the climate model. However, if there's a volcano, temperatures will go all over the place, but mostly down. Then you get this, which is extremely interesting. This is a relationship between the length of a solar cycle and the temperature in the next solar cycle. And what it tells you is if you have a short solar cycle, followed by a long one, you'll get a drop in temperature. We've just had a 9.5-year solar cycle, followed by one of 13.5. And that says, if you base it just based on Hanover, USA, we'll get a cooling of about 2 degrees in this coming solar cycle. And then you've got Northern Ireland, a record from 1796 to 1992, that comes out about 1.4 for the same length. Then you've got debuilt in the Netherlands from 1705 to 2000, says 1 degree. And then the whole island from Norway, and they all say about 1.3 degrees. All this evidence says, chances are, we're heading for cooling. And actually, I actually didn't notice it today. And yesterday, I think, just a bit. So computer models predict warming, sunspots predict cooling. Which will it be? So now I'll change from that, having convinced you entirely that it's all fraud, or something like that. And I've got to talk about renewable energy, because this merges into the other things I've talked about. So renewable energy, wind farms, solar cells, tidal power, and marine current power, and wave power, and all that sort of thing. Okay. Governments have been persuaded that they will reduce the risk of dangerous man-made global warming, substantially reduce emissions, substantially reduce the need for burning fossil fuels, provide, this is for America, energy independence, mitigate the problem of peak oil, and provide low-cost electricity, but only one day in the future. It won't. It's a fraud. First, world energy resources are huge. The resources available to mankind are larger than they have ever been in the past, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise, because they're lying. It's not with availability. We've got coal, 830 billion tonnes, 130 years. And this is just discovered stuff and known to be there. Gas reserves, 830 trillion metre cubed. But shale gas has now increased the reserves by 40%. Now this isn't new gas, it's gas that's been known to be there, but we couldn't get it out. Technological advances mean we can now get it out, and the greenies are now trying to stop you getting it. The total proven oil reserves are for 42 years. But we've got oil from coal and all sorts of other things, and oil from tar sand and that sort of thing. And 40 years is about what the reserves have been for the last 100 years. And for the last 100 years they've been saying, peak oil's coming, peak oil's coming. Ain't come yet, and it's not. So, exploration will continue. More will be found. You've got huge reserves of tar sands and the undersea methane. You've got this enormous amounts of methane ice off the east coast of New Zealand and many other places. It's a bit of a trick trying to get it out, but for sure it's possible. Technology will provide. And then you've got nuclear energy. Uranium resources are 80 years supply proven, but that's only because it's not worthwhile going any further. Expected at least 250, 1,000 years with breeder reactors. But if we go into thorium, which we should be doing anyway because it's a better fuel, 3 times abundant uranium. 750 years supply, maybe more from thorium. And remember, the uranium is as abundant as tin. We've been mining tin for 7,000 years, and it's getting cheaper. Well, not recently, but in general, it's got cheaper. So nuclear power can supply all the energy we need for more than 500 years. Just think about that. So here's one of the options which we do for New Zealand. Small sealed and physically safe nuclear reactors. There's 3 examples. There's a sealed one of 325, another very interesting one of 25 megawatts, would replace isolated diesel power stations all over the world. What an enormous benefit to mankind. Diesel power stations are hideous and unreliable, high maintenance, polluting. They're always junk heaps too. And there's a very interesting Babcock and Wilcox unit, 4 by 125 megawatt unit. All sealed, all factory made, not much work on site. Dig a hole, put them in, plug them in, switch them on, and every 10 years you exchange a factory, you do a factory exchange of the unit. So energy, the world has ample sustainable energy resources at a reasonable price. If we harness them properly, our cost of energy would probably go down. When enough peak oil arrives, alternatives will be found. We can decide to use these resources, or we can obey the greenies and decide that we won't even look at them. We won't even examine the problems. We'll try and mitigate the problems. We just close the door, which is what they're trying to do with shale gas in New Zealand now. If we don't use these resources, world energy supplies will become expensive and unreliable. Right now, we have a peak demand this morning. We've got about 500 or 600 megawatts of wind power that was producing less than 100. The system was at a peak. Cost was, the spot price was over 40 cents. That's how bloody useless wind is. And poor people will suffer most. And this is why I'm talking about here, the sort of people I'm talking about. These are the people that the greenies are killing. They're condemning the life of poverty, chopping down forests for wood, using cow dung for fuel. They talk about renewable energy. Both of those are renewable, but they're certainly not sustainable. I think the greenie attitude is an absolute disgrace. So let's go to our power system. The electricity market. The system doesn't reward generators who hold reserve funds for dry years and emergencies. You only get paid if you generate. Whole fundamental of the New Zealand system is that if you get a dry year, you have to have plant available to take over. The market has destroyed that. So every time we get a dry year, we have a shortage or high prices. The generators maximise their profits by keeping us on the edge of a shortage. The market has caused the rundown of our once world-leading ripple control system. All you have storage water heaters, which you've paid extra for. Most of you will have ripple control relays. Most of the time it's not being used by me. Now when I was a boy, I used to run the ripple control for the Auckland Power Board. We could hold the Auckland load at 144 megawatts for 12 hours, steady, by constantly managing the ripple control. Now Vector doesn't do that, and the load of Auckland is probably 200 megawatts higher than it needs to be. You're paying for that generating plant, the extra capacity, and all the other things. You've been forced into buying storage water heaters. You're not given the opportunity to make a profit. And the windfall profits in the industry since 2002 have been more than $4 billion. And the market was instituted to give us low-cost electricity. Here we have a curve that appeared in one of the reports on the market, and I've marked it up. Before we had a market from 74 to 02, when we were building quite a lot of power stations, the total cost of electricity rose by about $100 million a year. As soon as the market started operating at the end of 02, it went up to $400 million a year. Why? Because the people who bought the hydropower stations were getting 5, 6, 7 cents a kilowatt hour for power that cost them 1 or 2 cents to generate, so they were making obscene profits, so they racked up the asset values to camouflage the fact they were obscene profits. They bought these stations for $1,000 a kilowatt and now value them over $3,000. And we're not getting a very good return on our asset value. They've been racked up and up and up. That's why you're paying so much bills. Not all this rubbish about, oh, if you want us to build new power stations, you've got to pay more. When did you go into a supermarket and says, well, we've decided that in order to serve you better, we've got to expand this supermarket. So our prices have gone up by 5%. That's exactly what they're saying. That's great. The price increase will continue, and then an emissions trading scheme at $20 a tonne will add $800 million, which is about 10% to your electricity bill. And the windfall profits from existing hydro and geothermal stations will be obscene, and taxes and SOE profits will be a major source of government income. All the government-owned SOEs are making special dividends to the government all the time, and breaking it in. So the emissions trading scheme was spawned by a blind belief that man-made greenhouse gases was dangerous level of water. And as I said, that's fraud. It is based on a belief that the IPCC report is gospel. It's based on climate models of fraud. This government said we won't move fast in Australia, and then it did just that. Why did he do that? He had every opportunity to sit on his hands and say, I'm not doing anything until everybody else does. And keep on saying, oh, we're working towards all sorts of good things, which is right for the legal thing to do. So now we've got a carbon trading scheme which includes agriculture, like no other country in the world. It won't reduce New Zealand's emissions, because what it will do is make our productive industries move overseas, and with the same goods will be made with higher emissions. So if it reduces our emissions, it will be more than compensated for overseas. Will it bring windfall profits? Yes, enormous windfall profits. Will it benefit New Zealand? Of course. It will cost every household in the country $1,000 or more per year for nothing. All on the basis of fraud. Greenhouse gas trading, this is the core of it, and this is why there's so many people pushing it so hard. No one can measure accurately the amount of greenhouse gases absorbed by growing forest, emitted by a power station, or farmed by cows. 30% of more of the trades around the world are fraudulent. It's almost certainly a lot more. Absolutely made for fraud. If the buyer or seller can persuade the auditor to inflate the amount of greenhouse gases on the certificate, both parties benefit. And of course the auditor probably gets a backhanded from both parties. Because you're not trading carbon dioxide, you're trading a piece of paper. And if you've got a forest and he's got a factory, and I'm the auditor, and you persuade me that your forest will bring 200 tonnes, not 100, and I say, okay, but you'll have to accept the lower price. You say, that's fine. I go back to you and say, well, you're looking for 100 tonnes, you thought that maybe at this much. I've got a wonderful deal for you. I've got you 150 tonnes at a cheaper price. You've both won. Now, any other trade where fraud's involved, one party loses and one party wins. And it's the auditor goose, one party's out. Big time. But here you are, you both benefited, so you can be backhand. It's made for fraud. Absolutely. Anyway, that's the end. And just for something quite different, I thought I'd show you a bridge that I saw crossing the Zambia and northwest Zambia when I was there a couple of years ago. Piece of African engineering. Yes, I love it. And then we've got, this is what the termites did when I told them about the New Zealand emissions trading scheme. I was wonderful. And termites have its lots of methane, and nobody knows how much. Much more than the cars belt, by a huge amount. So there we are. I'm happy to take questions. You got time? Okay.
Right.
Yes.
The earlier graph you showed where you showed a very close correlation between temperature and those other things.
Yeah.
What are those other things?
The Pacific Decadal Oscillation, you're really testing me, is I don't know. I know that they're climate related. I don't actually know what they are. But they're both the same sort of oscillation. One in the Atlantic, one in the Pacific. And natural oscillation. I think it's temperature.
It's pressure between Tahiti and Darwin.
No, there's a Southern Oscillation Index, which is different again. Repeating of it is something different. But it's an index of what's happening climatically in the Atlantic and the Pacific.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Brian, do we orbit the sun the same distance consistently, or do we get closer sometimes and further away others at that
We get a little bit closer, and so on. But one of the theories is that the gravitational center of the planetary system, the whole system, is not in the middle of the sun. So the sun doesn't orbit around the gravitational center, and according to where it is, it reacts on the activity of the sun. And they say that the giant planets, Jupiter and Saturn, have an effect on where they are in orbit, has an effect on the sun and its orbit, and this has an effect on the climate. This is one of the many theories of how climate changes. And there's another theory relating to clouds, but I'll come to it later. Right, thanks, yeah.
Bryan, I was just mentioning to you before, the amount of money we pay for power in New Zealand is about 3 times what it is in the US, which is scandalous.
Yep.
How are we going to change that?
It's virtually impossible now. The reason that the whole electricity market is a disaster is that some idiot decided that electricity was a commodity like any other. And I remember Lincoln called in the introduction to it saying this: when the price goes up, the demand will go down. It doesn't happen. But the economics 101 rules for a market commodity: there must be price elasticity, and there must be an alternative good. So if you go into the supermarket and you buy baked beans and they're too expensive, you can buy spaghetti. Electricity, there is no alternative electricity. You can't run a computer on gas. You can't store it effectively, and the value is much higher than its cost. If your power grid down, you could pay probably $10 a kilowatt hour in some cases. If you're running an office, you would have to pay $10 a kilowatt hour or something to keep your office working, because everybody and everything's stopped. So it's not a market commodity, and they base this whole thing around it, and it's not working. And they're ever patching it up, saying, it's because these silly bastards won't hedge, or because they won't do this, because they won't do that. It's fundamentally flawed. And in March, Contact Genesis have a problem keeping Huntley running because of its income has been bad over the last 3 years because they've been wet. And they went to the Electricity Authority and said, look, we've got a problem, and we do need money every year to keep the station going. And the system desperately needs it, no doubt about that. And the Electricity Authority wouldn't do anything, so Genesis jacked the price up to $200 a kilowatt hour during that time of the transmission line. And that shit at the fan, something terrible. And in the end, the Electricity Commission decided it was an undesirable trading system because it cast doubt on the market and forced the price down to $5,000 or $50. And they didn't address the problem, which is what Genesis hope they do, which is somehow we need money every year, even if our station's not running. That's a key fact identified in 1997, and people still won't admit the problem. Yeah.
Yes, do you believe that the emissions trading scheme is here to stay, or do you think it's still so much it will go?
I would like to be able to say I believe it'll go. The reason I'm nervous about that is they're paying out heaps of dollars to the foresters in carbon credits. And so they've locked themselves in, all the foresters, into some sort of expectation. But it'd be far cheaper to buy them off and continue with the ETS. And at the moment, there's a big convoy, we heard about it in Australia going on about it. The government, even though it might bring the carbon tax, could fall any time. And so the whole thing's pretty uncertain. I think the government's probably getting nervous, but they've painted themselves in too much of a corner. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier on about, obviously, if we can't control electricity prices per car.
Yeah.
So we need to look at alternative energy. You mentioned nuclear energy.
Yeah.
And those little devices, how safe are they?
Far safer than any other form of electricity generation, including hydropower. That's the reality of it. I got a trip to UK and France 3 weeks ago to look at nuclear power and nuclear fuel recycling and nuclear wastes and the shipping of the nuclear waste through the Tasman Sea to Japan. And the precautions they take are incredible. But I also found a book called Radiation Reason that says the present radiation safety levels are down here somewhere. The actual safety level is up here somewhere. And if everybody accepted they need to revise the safety levels they were set years before we knew much about the effects of radiation, the whole perception that nuclear power is extremely dangerous would disappear.
So you say...
It's still got problems. If you stand by a canister of waste, which is about that big, you stand close to it, you'll be dead in a minute.
So you
But you don't have to do that.
Brian, are you suggesting then that instead of the big nuclear stations, we have to have a whole series of little speeds?
I think so. The debate going on in the industry, whether the big one, I think there's probably a place for both. New Zealand wouldn't like to accommodate a 1600 megawatt single unit, but these little things are good. And the other thing is you can, whether it's different sort of climate, you can put them around the periphery of cities and get over the transmission line problem. So they've got huge potential. Yes?
Perhaps it's for emotive purposes, but I noticed that you have cows farting is the cause.
Sorry?
You have in your notes that cows farting is one of our problems. It's actually burping.
Yeah, I know. Farting's
More emotive.
I didn't put burping, but no, let's go for pig.
That's another F.
Yes?
Brian, apparently Germany are leading the world in solar panels associated with housing, providing the home with energy, but also contributing to the national grid. Why don't we do something like that?
Because it's as mad as you can be. It's absolutely bravery crazy. The Germans are subsidising those solar panels by 5 or 6 times the retail cost of power, not the wholesale cost of power. When you have a peak demand in Germany, it's in the winter evenings when they're not producing anything. You've got all kinds of metering problems. A cloud goes over the sun, the output disappears. And the idiots, as they are in England, are paying a higher subsidy for ones on houses than they are for big farms. Why? If the objective is to have renewable energy, and if they want to subsidise it, which is stupid, it should be one subsidy for all renewable energy, and the best one comes out. But here they are picking solar power to win it. It's crazy. Wind farms are the same, they're subsidised badly. The UK government is committed to squandering $200 billion on them. They can't afford it, and they won't do any good. Because last winter, they had fairly heavy demands, very cold winter in the UK. Over some of the peak demand periods, the output from several thousand megawatts of wind farms was, I think, less than 100 megawatts. So when you need it, they're not there, and solar is the worst of all. But in the middle of the summer, when the demand is low, and everybody's off on holiday, they're producing heaps of power, pushing it into the system, which get an embarrassment and don't know what to do with it. And it's paying heaps of money for power that's no use at all.
That's a good note.
Yeah.